Hello, my name's Nathan Loynes. I am the module tutor for this module evaluating mentoring in the support of children, young people and families. In this video I'll be giving a brief overview of what to expect within the module, but also introducing you to some of the issues in evaluating mentoring. The purpose behind these videos, as I said in the session, are to serve as aid memoirs that you might watch again when it's closer to completing and handing in the assignment, and some of the content might make a little bit more sense to you when you're able to understand it in context and with a greater understanding of mentoring, which you will have gained from attending more sessions. There are three recurring themes really when we come to understand mentoring, which will feature in more or less every single session this semester. First of all, the definitional issue is that how do we define mentoring? The term itself means many things to many different people. Also, the fact that mentoring occurs in lots of different contexts, from business through to therapeutic type contexts, means that it's very difficult for us to come to a shared and universally agreed definitional understanding of the term mentoring. Also, when we come to understand the term evaluation and evaluating, there are many different ways of evaluating a program or project success. And indeed the term is used in an everyday sense when we are requiring others to analyse or evaluate a certain thing. There are also methodological issues related to evaluation, in the fact that there are very few studies complete of mentoring programs in the UK. The majority of the material comes from the USA, and there are transferability issues, i.e. how reliable is USA data and how valid is USA data? Can it actually be applied to the UK situation, given that the USA and UK cultures are very different, and indeed mentoring applications are very different. Finally, we need to consider or continue to bear in mind the ethical implications of mentoring. What is it that mentoring's actually setting out to do? Is it really about empowering and helping other people, or is it a more subtle means of social control in getting others, in our case the mentees, to conform? In Lectures 1 and Lecture 5 we'll be considering these issues of empowerment, resilience and social control. The idea of mentoring holds great appeal. It conjures up a positive way of bridging boundaries between generation and harks back to the notions of large extended families and family neighbourhoods within which young people and elders could establish common ground. And there's a view of education in that the purpose of education is intended to transmit the culture from one generation to the next. And we might see that those mechanisms for transmitting culture have broken down, and therefore the appeal of mentoring is strong. In Lecture 5 we'll be considering mentoring around risk, as well as mentoring in the UK developing around the learning mentor or schools and integrated services agenda. Mentoring has also been developed with some success in the field of youth justice and youth work, and this is particularly focused on getting young people to engage in less risk-taking behaviour. Clearly, if you'd like to read these slides in more detail, you can press pause on the video at any time. In Lecture 10 we'll be looking at the wider context of mentoring, i.e. the UK policy changes that have led to young people becoming more and more dependent on their parents for sources of support for longer and longer. And with this, young people are faced with greater periods of ambiguity, which is protracted and can cause them distress and cause them to respond in manners that we saw in the August 9th, 10th, 2011 riots within the UK, where many people expressed their frustrations at this predicament, and there is an audio file online where you can listen to young people doing just that. In lecture 6 we'll be looking at empowerment, resilience and social control, and the fact that mentoring programs could be seen as the knight in shining armour, if you like, coming to the rescue of those poor young children and young people who do not receive the perceived necessary family support from the home environment. Therefore, mentoring is seen as a remedial function to assist young people to get the support that they do not receive, and the undertone is should receive, from their families. In lecture 9 we'll be looking at the process of evaluating outcomes, again a methodological lecture where we try to consider, do the outcomes experienced by young people match up to the aims that are intended when various mentoring programs are begun. In lectures 9 and 10 we'll be looking at this idea of Bordeaux in cultural capital, and the possibility that the role of the mentor is to facilitate what are referred to here as recipes or strategies for young people to be empowered to deal with problems themselves. So the idea is not to create a culture of dependency between the mentor and mentee, but rather to enable young people to create and synthesize their own solutions to their ongoing problems based on what has worked in the past. The successful recipe here, according to Philip and Henry. In lecture 7 we'll be looking at mentoring in the context of integrated and extended services, as this is required within the module objectives, and we'll see how mentoring fits within this agenda that really began in 1997 under the auspices of the Social Exclusion Unit, but really found its feet in the 2003 Every Child Matters agenda and beyond. Also in lecture 7 we'll be looking in more detail at how mentoring can foster resilience, but also to bear in mind that the scope of this course is not just focused on the remedial services that tend to be intended for young people in mid to late teens, i.e. when they end up in the youth justice system or remedial school systems, but rather there is an opportunity to begin effective mentoring work in this period that Freud referred to as latency, between the ages of 6 and 13, when young people are perhaps more receptive to the learning experiences that can be developed in effective mentoring. And we'll be looking at the Action for Children report there. In lecture 7 we're going to look at more detail at the Integrated and Extended Services agenda, and here Broadhead and Martin identify that those professionals located in schools and multi-agency teams that have a mentoring remit perhaps have more background understanding of what the children are experiencing day to day in their home environment and relationships than perhaps was possible under the older model, and we're talking about 10 years ago or so here, within school, where teaching staff were expected to undertake this pastoral support. So here we are into today's lecture proper, if you like, and this will be one of the very few times where I'm using PowerPoint. I don't tend to rely on PowerPoint because of the lineal way in which information is presented, but you'll come to understand that when you see the other presentations. So moving on to today's session in proper, lecture 1, what is mentoring? Mentoring is essentially about change, and the way that change is experienced internally by the individual is correctly referred to as a transition. Some of you might have come across the word transition in terms of transition from one school to another, but it has a much wider, broader meaning in that how does a person experience transformative change. A lot has been written over the last 30 years, perhaps influenced by people like Stan Cohen's work around moral panics, which has become to be known as the transition discourse, and how young people have negatively experienced the transition from childhood into adulthood. And here that transition between childhood and adulthood is referred to as this quite substantial 12 years between 13 and 25. However, these transitions are not unfragmented and clear-cut. In the session you will have undertaken a group task which got you to think about what were some of your concerns about growing up and what evidence were these concerns based on. And this was to get you to identify as a human being in modern society that these issues around transition don't affect some other group, to use Gordon Allport's concept, but actually affect all of us going through transitions. And this task was intended to get you to think about transitions that you've gone through and begin the process of identification with empathic identification with mentees. You can read this in your own time, but Brinner notes that although the dominant discourse on transitions tends to assume that all young people go through the same sorts of transitions in an identical manner, Brinner makes a distinction between middle-class transitions as being distinct in certain kinds of ways from working-class transitions. And you can read those and think about those in your own time. Another way of thinking about transitions are these critical events that occur within childhood and adolescence, and these usually are focused around bereavement or loss of some kind and coming to terms with some loss. And that loss doesn't mean loss of a significant other, although it can do in the case of bereavement or divorce and family breakdown. It almost also means the loss of an established way of life, such as becoming homeless, leaving care, or entering residential or institutional type services. In the previous exercise, when I asked you to think about the kinds of things that caused you concern and how you negotiated that through the period of transition, Marcus and Nurius, 1986, developed this term, this idea of possible selves, in which people become the people they become through testing out hypotheses or potentialities of what they may become. Quite simply, one person might discuss with a peer that they want to become a doctor, and then imagine and discuss what it would be like in their future life being a doctor. And this is then testing out possible selves. Alternatively, one person may discuss with their peer the possibility of becoming a possible self, a possible criminal in the future. And here we can see how the mentoring relationship could intervene in those what the mainstream would consider as destructive peer group relationships. When a peer discusses with another peer the possible self of becoming a criminal, mainstream society does not approve of that, and therefore it would be recommended that a mentor intervenes into that relationship and discusses more salubrious possible selves available. Our doctor example, for example. Furthermore, recent research into possible selves as a construct suggests that these constructs develop when people are engaged in effectively significant relationships. And these effectively significant relationships might be termed in lay terms caring relationships that exist between youth worker, mentor or peers. I then got you to reflect on experiences that you'd had in which you were effectively helped by a helper from heaven, if you like, and what the qualities of that experience and what that helper brought to the relationship, and in contrast, experiences when you have not been helped at all, required help but did not receive the necessary help. And I asked you to look at these under the right hand column, helper from hell. This study by Forrest in 1999 concluded that flexibility is key in the mentor's arsenal. This flexibility we'll look at in more detail in the second semester when we reflect on the necessary skills for effective mentoring. But just to reiterate, the kinds of things that you came up with in your helper from heaven and helper from hell list, very similar lists were generated by this Forrest 1999 study. One of the features of the mentoring relationship is this approach known as informal education. Perhaps in pedagogic circles it's referred to as reflexive education, or thinking on one's feet, to use the terminology of Donald Shon, whereby a person is much more flexible in their approach and less perhaps didactic than traditional teaching methods. There's also a need for the mentor to be perceptive and have skill in catching the moment in order to respond reflexively in conversations with young people, in order to deepen their thinking or put themselves in touch with their feelings. And we might use Socratic questioning, which we'll look at in more detail in semester 2, to look about this catching the moment idea and interacting reflexively. For next week, I'd like you to make sure that you have registered on Moodle, and there's the passkey. That's because I do host the support materials on Moodle and have adopted a blended learning approach, this video being part of that, and I'm aware that much of the information that you and content that you receive in the initial lectures does not make much sense conceptually until you've experienced the later lectures, and therefore they're available online for you to go back and refresh yourself. So when it comes to answering the essay question, you can refresh your memory on the content by watching the 8 or so 15-minute videos to get you up to speed to what the bare basics of what we've covered over the content of that semester. I'd like you to read the Colley and Hodgkinson and Malcolm article on non-formal learning with the question in mind: how does this relate to mentoring? Also, I'd like you to watch the 18-minute video by Chris Anderson on informal collaborative learning and think about if that has any sort of application in perhaps peer mentoring opportunities. But also, I think the video's interesting in that perhaps it challenges the preconceived ideas that you might have about learning and how an individual can retake control of their own learning rather than feel that it's something that's foisted upon them. So I'd like you to watch the video with that in mind. I have advised that you do read the Colley et al. Article and summarise perhaps the 6 key points on the back of the article and come prepared to the session in order to discuss those points. Okay, thanks for listening. It was nice to meet you all in the session, and I look forward to engaging in interesting discussions with you in the future. Thanks.